and they grew everything they ate. Feeling a lot better, we hot-seated it the rest of the way. Compared to the Southwest, the fields were green and fertile. We saw some communities like Greensburg. We wish there were more. The closer we got to the end of our journey, the better we felt. The next day, we hit the outskirts of New York City.
New York City is engaged in the greatest urban experiment of our time. From skyscrapers that grow their own food, to an all-electric vehicle fleet, to clean and tranquil parks. Inspired leaders and creative minds are working together to create an urban paradise.
I looked across the George Washington Bridge at the skyline and felt a surge of hope, but underneath ran a trickle of worry. With all we had seen, maybe we had seen nothing yet. By the middle of the century, I thought I'd seen it all. Storms, migrations, and droughts that had destroyed whole cities. But I had also seen so much more. Brilliant people everywhere were working furiously to change our future. I had a family, and together I thought we might be equal to whatever came our way. But I had no idea of what the future would hold.
It's a new world, and not a better one as we catch up with Lucy, our fictional storyteller. The year is 2060, past mid-century and into middle age for Lucy. At 51, she has grown up in a world of soaring population, dwindling resources, and intense climate change. The worst-case scenario, imagined by some experts, is playing out. But there are signs of hope, a growing global movement led by cities like New York.
New York is probably the most geographically favored city in America. Great port, rich fisheries around it, this wonderful river that allows transport and access to great farmland. It's a center of the arts. It's been a center of finance. I think it'll continue to be so.
After what we had been through, New York was a fresh start. The city was full of hope and energy and promise. You'd walk down the streets and meet each other's eyes and see a sense of purpose. It was a great place to be a part of back then. The first years we were there were the best of our lives. Josh was working as an engineer on the Great Barrier Project. I was at Bellevue Hospital, a historic institution already more than 300 years old. The building we lived in was green in every sense of the word, and Molly worked in the gardens that grew our food. They were a part of the building itself.
You're going to see greenhouses, multi-story greenhouses, and each floor will be growing, carrots and potatoes, etc., and that'll be just considered normal.
The building supplied not just our food, but most of our own energy.
Instead of having solar panels, big, heavy, bulky things, we can just put this thin film on rooftops, on window panes, and generate electricity that way.
I rode my bike to work every day, a mere 30 blocks. We had designated bicycle lanes. The traffic was manageable, and you could breathe the air. All the vehicles were electric.
You hook your car up to a mega transport system that will move you a good bit of the distance to your final destination, kind of a train of cars. And then you get disconnected from the mass combination transit and drive the last little bit yourself.
Molly fell in love as quickly as her parents had. She married George, who was studying to become a botanist. A year later, my grandson Daniel was born, and a lovelier child I had never seen. It was a happy time. And when Molly told me they were moving upstate to work on a real farm, Josh and I understood. It had always been their dream. The city was getting a lot of attention, and money flowed in, both private and public. The biggest, and maybe the most important project, was my husband Josh's, since without the barriers, the city was at risk.
It would be the biggest civil engineering project in US history. Be comparable to putting man on the moon.
The project had been underway for years, and those who worked on it had a tremendous sense of pride. There were 3 barriers going up. One at the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, one at the top of the East River, and one in Staten Island at Batten Hills. You could see them rising a little every day. Sea level was rising, and without the barriers, big storms would flood the city.
I think it'd be like in medieval times, people building a beautiful, huge cathedral. It took generations to build, and there was a great sense of purpose and gave purpose and meaning to life.
The project drew thousands of people into the city looking for work. New York City was then, as it had always been, a beacon of hope.
In New York, it'll be a magnet. As any viable city will be a magnet. These cities, where people come to flee, become petri dishes for diseases and new diseases and resistant forms of disease.
There are a number of infectious diseases that are currently confined to tropical and subtropical areas that are likely to spread into temperate zones. And this is something that I'm very concerned about.
Keeping New York safe from disease was crucial, and Bellevue was busy. I didn't feel as tired at the end of the day as I might have. We were doing important work, keeping a close eye on any new diseases. I remember the night I was called to the workers' camps in Flushing. A young Ecuadorian family had just arrived in New York, and they all had high fevers and blisters on their hands and feet. We sprung into action immediately, closed off the neighborhood, and called in the CDC. They knew right away they were looking at a new virus. We set up a mobile clinic at the camps where we treated dozens of workers and their families. Everyone recovered, and the disease was contained.
Imagine now the year 2070. Things are in danger of unraveling. Sea levels have risen nearly 3 feet, redrawing the map of the world. Island nations have disappeared. Much of Bangladesh reclaimed by the sea. Some of California's famous beaches gone. The Florida Everglades underwater. Now the richest countries are being forced to come up with innovative and expensive solutions. Lucy's husband, Josh, is one of the leaders.
Josh was an engineer on the Great Barrier Project. After 30 years in the making, it was nearing completion. Within a few months, they would be testing the massive gates.
If I was the engineer in charge, I would be very nervous. But you would have practice runs, and during nice weather, you would say, all right, let's close the gates today and make sure everything's working right, it's not going to jam up.
Josh was worried about something else, too. New York City's barriers, like others around the world, had been built on the assumption that sea level rise would be gradual. But it was becoming clear that might not be the case.
Scientists say they are detecting a massive spike in the level of methane in the atmosphere.
Climate in general doesn't change smoothly the way You know, we're used to seeing projections from climate models.
We find that the transitions from warm to cold or cold to warm, some of those transitions can be really, really abrupt. Abrupt meaning within the timescale of a decade, or sometimes even less than a decade.
We knew there were certain things that could rapidly turn up the heat, but we didn't know what that tipping point would be until it happened.
Maybe the tipping point is you heat up the tundra and the permafrost so much that there's a huge burp of methane and carbon dioxide out of those northern soils.
Methane is a very big worry in my mind because it's some 23 to 30 times more potent than CO2.
An enormous reservoir of methane produced by decomposing plants and animals lies buried beneath the frozen Arctic tundra. It has been there since the Ice Age. If the tundra thaws and a large quantity of the gas is released, global temperatures would soar.
This is a bit like a light switch. You push the light switch a little bit and nothing happens. You push a little bit more and nothing happens. Then you push it a little bit more and it flips completely to a new state.
The methane emanating from the Arctic could raise temperatures worldwide.
A panel of experts is convening to recalculate how warm the planet
drastically raise global temperatures.
This is what specialists call a nonlinear flip or a nonlinear change. When that happens, we don't know what the consequences will be.
Spiking global temperatures are wreaking havoc with the Greenland ice sheet.
Some fear that the colossal sheet is on the verge of collapse. Unless drastic measures are taken, low-lying coastal cities around the world could expect to see disastrous flooding.
Citizens are demanding their governments respond to the impending temperature. The Pentagon today held closed-door meetings to discuss climate change.
Our top story tonight, the President is announcing the Cosmic Shield Project, which aims to halt the disintegration of the Greenland ice sheet.
Imagine now that you're the President of the United States, and you have word that Greenland is going to collapse in the next 10 years, adding 7 meters of sea level. I'm not saying that is happening today. I'm saying imagine that were to happen. And you were told that technology exists to stop it. Wouldn't you be tempted to use it?
It didn't take long for the world to agree. A technology existed that could stop the ice sheets from melting. It should be used. Hundreds of jets from all around the world were spraying a mist of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The gas would form particles which would shade the Earth and temporarily cool it.
This is your solution of last resort. You say all bets are off. We are just going to intervene in this system with reckless abandon.
For a year, there were these spectacular sunsets.
But what are the other consequences of those things? Maybe it would cool the Earth, maybe it would cool it too much. That might be a disaster in the opposite direction. Maybe it would cause some other environmental problem that we don't foresee today.
The Earth cooled, but that was the least of it.
Tonight in Washington, there's debate over whether to follow China and Great Britain and cease flying Cosmic Shield mission.
We've learned that in all aspects of engineering, there are unintended consequences.
The Surgeon General testified before Congress today on the health effects of further depleted.
The cloud was burning off the ozone layer. Once that was gone, every living creature would be exposed to a massive dose of radiation. The experiment was halted. Once they stopped spraying the gas, the ice sheets continued to melt, but now at a quicker pace. Sea level rise would soon be measured in feet, not inches.
If you end up with several meters of sea level rise, you change life as we know it.
In New York, watchdog groups are now suggesting that storm surge barriers may be too low.
Josh and the other engineers were working around the clock to try to build the barriers even higher, but we all knew we were in a race against time.
Society is not set up to deal with rapid sea level rise. It would be a catastrophe of a magnitude we've never experienced.
One of our political leaders said not too long ago that the American way of life is non-negotiable. And we're going to discover the hard way that when you don't negotiate the circumstances that are sent to you by the universe, you automatically get assigned a new negotiating partner named reality. And then it will negotiate for you. You don't even have to be in the room.
A vicious nor'easter is headed up the East Coast and is expected to hit New York on the high tide this afternoon. Storm surge could be over 20 feet.
As the storm approached, the engineers started closing the entire bay wall. It absolutely had to work or the city would be devastated. It was terrifying. Then the winds picked up and a gate got stuck.
That's a nightmare scenario, getting stuck halfway shut, because the water will pour in and flood the city.
A team was assembled to manually close the gate. They would have to go out into the harbor by boat. I asked Josh not to go. I begged him to stay safe with me. But this was his project. He had to see it through.
Preliminary reports that one of the gates in the Great Barrier has failed to close.
We're awaiting confirmation from the mayor's office.
It was high tide when the storm hit.
Flooding of subway tunnels throughout.
4, 5, and 6 trains are affected.
The streets were filling with water.
The mayor has made the decision to evacuate City Hall.
Something had gone terribly wrong.
Seeing truly catastrophic flooding.
The tide comes in, and on top of that, the surge.
The Holland and Lincoln tunnels are filling with seawater.
When New York begins to flood, it'll be total chaos.
There's an evacuation order in effect.
The Office of Emergency Management says we have to evacuate. We've got a problem. The subway is full of seawater and it is shut down. What do people do?
Authorities are now telling anyone still in the city to remain calm and stay inside.
Outside, the storm raged, and all I could do was wait for Josh to come home. When I heard the knock on my door, I knew. He died a hero, they said, but that was no comfort. I called Molly, and she wept. She wanted me to come live with her, but I couldn't leave. I just couldn't leave.
At 4 or 5 feet of water, we could see the worst of this storm by 3 a.m.
New Yorkers are going to wake up in a very different city tomorrow.
As the sun rose the next day, it was clear that both my city and my life had been destroyed.
Battery Park fills up with seawater. Lower West Side, Lower East Side, southern Brooklyn, Queens is flooded. Kennedy Airport's flooded. Newark Airport's flooded. It's all going to be underwater.
In the coming days, when the waters receded, the city was filthy and everything that could rot was rotting. People wanted to leave, but for many of them, there was nowhere to go.
How welcoming will people be when New York or Boston sink underwater and all those people in their millions come to New England or to Pennsylvania? How welcoming will people be?
I packed my things and set them at the door. But I didn't leave. I suppose you could say I was stubborn, and I was needed at Bellevue more than ever. There were millions who needed someone to care for them. As the seas rose, the wealthy moved uptown to higher ground and hired private companies to pick up the trash. But in the low-lying slums, tap water was contaminated. People were so poor they ate only once a day, if they ate at all.
When people are hungry and people are malnourished, as you continue to have displacement with floods, there's no doubt that's a perfect setup for certain types of infections.
I was working the late shift when the first case came in. A young man with a cough and a high fever, and then I noticed the blisters all over his body. Was this the virus I had seen years ago?
Another case of Caspian fever.
Health officials have issued a statement asking people to avoid public meetings. All New York City schools have been shut down. Representatives from the CDC
confirm that this virus is cause for concern.
Within a week, over 20 were dead. People on the streets wore masks, avoided each other. The air was ripe with panic.
advisory reminding citizens to wash their hands and cover their mouths.
You would shut down factories, you would shut down trade, you would shut down commerce. Everything would shut down.
Death toll from Caspian fever has now reached 107.
The virus continued to mutate and spread.
So some long incubating virus that kills very fast. That's the kind of thing that's going to get us.
It only took a few people on a few planes to spread it around the world.
Cases of the fever have been confirmed in over 100 countries.
Now estimated that 10,000 have died in Mexico City.
Temporary morgues have been set up in the streets of Shanghai.
The Vatican conducted a national funeral mass today.
From Singapore to Sydney, the globe shut down. Farmers wouldn't bring food into cities. Cargo ships wouldn't dock, let alone unload. Billions were on the verge of starvation. I saw hundreds of people die every day. I was immune, one of the lucky ones. It was hard to feel anything. There was too much to feel.
You think about the effect that this kind of disaster would have. Everybody's depressed. What do you do with all the bodies? Are people just gonna, take their loved ones to the local park and leave them there?
At that point, cities will be unbearable.
You could see it on people's faces on the street. They had given up. As more and more people died, all services broke down. There were frequent blackouts. And now, connections to the internet were intermittent at best.
Around the world, deaths from the Caspian fever show no sign.
And then one day, the power just went out. The phones, the internet, the whole data network went down. Some said it was a terrorist. Others thought it was the flooding. Suddenly, no one knew anything for sure.
If communication breaks down, rumor becomes the communication system, then a mob psychology takes over.
Collapse is not something that actually happens overnight. It's the result of an accumulation of stresses and erosion of the internal strength of society, so that it just becomes like an eggshell, and one last shock breaks it.
Looting was rampant. Most of the police force deserted. The mayor was nowhere to be found. We waited for the president or the National Guard to appear, but no one came. That's when it dawned on us that the government, like so much else, had failed.
If the world breaks down, if globalization breaks down, then even the capacity of the United States to kind of manage a degraded global environment, I think, will come into question.
What we'll see is the federal government being viewed as something not to be taken seriously anymore.
Reports were sketchy, but here's what I know for sure. The virus continued to spread. India and China had gone to war over water and who knew what else. Millions were dying from famine. The human race was collapsing under its own weight.
By that time, I would guess that we will be seeing a substantial die-off of the human population. Most of civil society will have degenerated.
I was 75 when I walked across that George Washington Bridge. There were no checkpoints anymore. I left with a couple of friends and a dog who had adopted me. Rosie, I called her. She never left my side. But where was I going? I didn't know if Molly was still alive, let alone still on the farm up north. I didn't know if I had a grandson anymore. But that was my hope, that I could somehow find them, or they me.
Few hundred years down the line, they'll look back and say, the Dark Ages began in the 21st century.
Our city, beautiful city, was abandoned. And nature took over quickly, as it always has.
The breakdown would be rather rapid. The flooding of Manhattan would have a real destabilizing effect. The subway tunnels would flood and they would stay flooded. The columns that hold up the streets, they're steel, they will rust, they will corrode. The streets above them start caving in, and lo and behold, we have surface rivers once again in Manhattan.
Nature has that momentum, you see, to take this thing back. Perhaps we'll become like a jungle here. It won't be the asphalt jungle, it'll be the real jungle.
Your big skyscrapers here are well anchored into Manhattan schist. On the other hand, they weren't designed to be waterlogged. It just takes one hurricane to hit New York. Buildings are going to start to get taken out.
And it wasn't just the city. Our whole way of life had crumbled. But I found my daughter Molly and Daniel, my grandson. He was a young man now. Molly's husband, George, had been killed. Both of us were widows now. It is a hard life. The United States is fragmented into 1 million shards. We're all cut off from each other, each protecting what little we have.
It would be a wrenching transition. It would be a catastrophic transition. It's something we don't want to experience. The Dark Ages were called the Dark Ages for a reason.
I fear that we'll see a world like medieval Europe, where you have feudal states fighting for what remains of a source of water, a source of energy.
We managed to produce our own power and communicate over radio waves. The cities that have endured are now walled fortresses, jealously guarding whatever remains of the computer age.
I'm picturing enclaves of affluence and wealth, but surrounded by vast masses of people who will be barely surviving.
In effect, humanity could very well be in hell, where hell is defined as truth realized too late.
We have had to relearn what we had unlearned centuries before. How to live off the land, how to make do.
I think we'll see a world in which literature, the arts, democracy, those will disappear, largely disappear.
How much of the wonderful scientific breakthroughs of the 20th and 21st century will still be retained? If it's some electronic-based thing, it could all be lost.
My grandson Daniel might never hear a symphony, go to college, or read the books I read. He will never marvel at a right whale, the beauty of a coral reef, or a spotted owl.
If you actually ever get outside and just kind of look at the wonder of the world, it takes your breath away. And I think to think of a world where somehow that is taken away is really sad.
We're going to leave a planet that is so desperately beaten up that it will probably take hundreds of thousands of years to get it back, to restore it. We will have lost so much of our natural heritage.
I can teach him poems and songs. I can tell him what I saw and what I learned along the way. I can try to tell him what is precious. What is precious? I ought to know that. They say I am the oldest woman on earth. With age is supposed to come wisdom. What is precious? This earth of ours. This garden we must tend. These people we love.
Our future is not yet written. The ending to our story can still be changed. That when we come back. Lucy's story is a worst-case scenario of what could happen if we continue on our current path. It's a wake-up call, a challenge for us to plan a different course. But our experts say we must act immediately. Where did Lucy's world go wrong? What can we learn from their mistakes? We turn back the clock now to show you a vision of a future we can still create.
There's a future out there that's a much better future than the present that we're living in right now, to be sure.
If we took the measures we should take, 2100 would be at the beginning of an era that we today would regard as paradise.
We have a chance to get it right, to move from a disconnected, inefficient, world fighting populations to a sustainable planet. The problem we face today is how do we get from here to there?
The world that Lucy was born into is our world today. There are plenty of signs that it's in trouble, but there are hopeful signs as well.
The problems that we face, water, soil, climate change, they're all problems caused by humans, so we're capable of solving those problems.
It could be overwhelming if we let it. I just try to take it one brick, one chunk at a time. I think that's how you have to deal with it.
So what should we do right now to chart another course? How do we avoid ending up in Lucy's world? Many experts say the first step should be transforming how we use energy. Much of what we need to do, we already know.
Plant a garden. Use contact fluorescent bulbs or mass transit for people. Insulate your homes, smaller cars.
There is no simple solution, but 100% of the Earth's population doing a very small thing makes a very big difference.
But individuals alone won't be able to turn things around. Governments and industries are going to have to change on a massive scale.
We're going to have to come up with more solar, more wave power, more geothermal energy.
Beyond the familiar technologies, amazing new ones are already in the works. Fields of solar balloons that could power thousands of homes a day, a nuclear fusion facility that could produce the energy of a tiny man-made star.
We can't drill and burn our way out of our problems, but we can invent and invest our way out.
Getting enough of these projects up and running will take people, and that means jobs. And if we can put more people back to work, then by 2015, instead of communities disintegrating, they could start to rebound.
You can fight pollution and poverty at the same time. You can beat global warming and the economic downturn with the same dollar bill if you invested in green jobs, green energy, green technologies.
If we start those investments today, there wouldn't be gas lines and fights as in Lucy's world. Instead, there would be electric cars that could run 300 miles per charge. But completely redesigning our energy system would require rapid change. It would mean both sacrifice and hard work for the whole country. But we have done it before.
The thing I would compare it to is World War II. After Pearl Harbor, FDR turned to Detroit, the automakers, and said, you will now make tanks. You will now make Jeeps. Just like that. That was like overnight almost. And they did it.
And we won that war. It's going to take that same level of commitment.
Imagine that all of us did enough things that it made a real difference in our country. What effect does that have on China, on India, on other nations?
Well, if we don't set an example as the strongest and most important country in the world, what do we expect them to do? They're not going to follow if we don't lead.
World leaders are gathering in Washington, D.C. to attend an emergency global summit meeting.
A turning point in Lucy's world was the Global Summit of 2015. When the world leaders failed to agree on actions to slow climate change,
we do not accept the offer.
They set in motion all the disasters that would follow. But what if they had agreed?
For the first time ever, China, India, the U.S., and Europe have reached an agreement that could avert catastrophic climate change.
By tackling climate change, you end up tackling energy, you end up tackling food, you end up tackling water resources.
You could change this vicious cycle, I think, into a virtuous cycle.
Then what we could see is actually billions of people coming into far more stable, sustainable, prosperous economies.
As we move forward in the century, we will see the investments and hard choices we made early on begin to pay off.
The positive scenario is fossil fuels will be disappearing. We're growing more food with less water. We've restored ecosystems.
By the middle of the century, we would be using water and other resources much more carefully. Farmers would be planting drought-resistant crops. Water would be recycled, and there would be enough to support the U.S. Southwest. In 2050, places like Las Vegas could survive. The hope is that once we figure out how to solve these problems, we'll be in a much better position to help the rest of the world.
If we can actually raise the prospects of the bottom few billion people, we actually make global stability possible.
We reduce mass migration, refugee movements, desperation, actually slow population growth. And if we do all those things, we just bring a sustainable world prosperity closer to hand.
So there's a very good chance by about 2050, the worst part of the crisis having passed. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be big problems still to face, but it means that we will have avoided sailing right off the cliff.
When we come back, a different vision of the year 2100. By 2100, our world could be transformed.
Just imagine a city that's not polluted, that has a great transportation infrastructure.
Stackable cars, or cars that are folding, and then they would charge and be a shared ownership model, and you would just pull out the one that's available and that's fully charged. Everything happens inside the city itself. That means our food production, our waste and recycling, our energy.
We're going to have joint management of water resources, of energy resources. We're going to be living on a planet where we don't see things at a national level, but we see things at a global level.
By the time we get to 2100, the challenge of building a global green economy where we're sharing technologies, not fighting wars over water and oil, that's going to bring out the best in the human family.
Humanity will be relatively disease-free. Children will be treated as rare treasures.
Most people don't realize not only can we change, we must change. And I think that's how you own the future. That's how you take control of your destiny.
I have huge faith in humanity.
We will be able to create a world that will have a livable planet for our kids and their kids. That is our opportunity. That is our obligation.
Kids born today will see us navigate past the first greatest test of humanity, which is, can we actually be smart enough to live on a planet without destroying it?
In December this year, nearly 200 countries plan to meet in Copenhagen, Denmark. Their mission to draw up a strategy to finally come up with a global agreement to slow climate change and safeguard the planet. If you'd like to learn more about Earth 2100, or if you want to get involved in the solutions, go to our webpage at abcnews.com. I'm Bob Woodruff. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.